Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, a quick guide to improving your global submissions. My name is Rachel Johnson, and I'm the Marketing Manager here at AdvaMed, and I'm glad to welcome you to today's session. I would now like to introduce our speaker, Alex Butler. Alex has extensive background in medical device technology and innovation, with over 8 years devoted to product development, strategic planning, quality assurance, and process improvement. He oversees development and continuous improvement initiatives for several MasterControl core products, including registrations, RINs, and supplier. Prior to MasterControl, Alex served as a product development manager for Opal Orthodontics, where he was directly involved in the development, quality, compliance, risk management, registrations, and launch of several Class II medical devices. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alex to begin the presentation.
Okay, thank you. I trust everybody can see my screen. Good morning, good afternoon. It's actually morning here in Salt Lake City, but I appreciate everybody joining us. Hopefully we can get some good takeaways and get some good conversation off of this presentation, these slides. Again, my topic is RIM by numbers, so that's regulatory information management. Some people say regulatory information management solutions, software, etc. We'll get into a little more definition with that. But really a quick guide to improving your global submissions. I mean, ultimately what that means is getting product to the market sooner. Here we go. So just a quick summary here. We want to get into the state of regulatory today. There is so much change in this environment, life sciences, med device specifically. The more markets that you've targeted, the more nerve-wracking the submission processes become. We're going to get into some project management statistics and tips, but basically how do your regulatory initiatives grow in complexity? It's exponential, and again, for those of you in regulatory, you know the changes coming down the pipeline and how drastic that's going to be. It's really a perfect storm on the horizon. Changes in Canada, Europe, across the globe. Again, we'll do a deeper dive on that, but this is probably a year or two too late to really dive into these strategies. I mean, I don't want to say too late because we have to address them today, but the storm is coming, and in many cases it's already here. So just a key webinar takeaway, this is to offer strategies for simplifying your global submissions to ensure timely device registration. I would like to make the caveat that this is not a sales pitch. So this is whether you have a paper or digital process to manage your regulatory information. I want to teach you how to think about regulatory success across your organization, and then ultimately how that is mirrored in your quality management system. This is more of a presentation on how to think and strategize for regulatory success versus what to do or what to buy. Again, we will be taking questions at the end. I would consider those, even after the presentation, if you have questions on, again, your configuration in both RIMS or QMS, it doesn't matter which system you're using, we can give you good tips in order to optimize that. So we already went through a quick bio of me. This is, I guess, what I look like on a good picture day. Again, going back into my experience in the industry, releasing a handful of Class II products, but also maintaining Class II equivalent products, and then how we would target new markets, new health authorities across the globe. The company overall was in I think over 90 health authorities. My orthodontics division was in 19, but I saw the complexity of that with each new initiative, with each new regulatory change, with each new document change, these micro changes across the organization and how that would impact my regulatory submission manager, who I was partnered with on these development initiatives. In terms of, so here's an image of Salt Lake City. This is where those mountains, that's our backyard. That's where I like to play. That was my industry experience. My experience with software development. We've had multiple FDA engagements with current FDA as well as consultants from ex-FDA when we went to develop our regulatory information management system. I attend 5 to 6 conferences a year. We partnered with a tier 1 med device. Tier 1 might be our term, but that's as large as it gets. We partnered with them in the design on this, and really I don't want to get into the design of our product. I want to get into the discovery of their processes. And then behind that, we've had process discovery meetings with over 30 companies in the med device space alone. So really, this is just kind of a high-level abstract of pains in the system. But these should look familiar, whether you're in regulatory, quality, whatever your role is in your organization. The top pains can kind of be bucketed into, one is paper, and paper from a regulatory standpoint can be devastating. There's a lot to manage there. Rogue documents. This has been printed and shared with the health authority, but now it's been revised in the quality management system. Who is alerted? Who knows? Another one would be disparate processes. So we had 8 submission managers when I was in the industry, and we were very successful. We had 8 individual processes to manage regulatory communication, strategy, project planning, however that might be. We were all across the board. We had one manager who printed their documents, again, that paper rogue concern, and she was a very successful regulatory manager, and she had all of her documents on her desktop, tabletop behind her. And this was her process. It wasn't something that could be communicated to the next submission manager. It was very much owned by an individual, and that creates breakdowns. It also creates communication deficiencies. The next would be access and controls. Who has access to what content, when, where are we archiving, how do we engage with affiliates, distributors, partners in other markets? And then ultimately communication. We're going to get a little bit deeper into communication. How does regulatory communicate with the rest of the organization? How do they engage for regulatory success? But this is really where we found the breakdowns, the primary breakdowns. So just looking at the FDA, and again, these issues are compounded with each health authority that you engage in. This is just from the FDA's website, but basically showing you where the breakdowns are. So refusal to accept. You've submitted, you've done all of your due diligence, at least to your processes, your best practices, and the FDA has refused to accept. Just content formatting, clerical issues, basically, they've accepted. Then you have delays on requests for additional information. You go into more of a substantive review, so they've already rejected you just on the clerical stuff. Now they're going to do a deep dive into the content. There's a lot of interaction. That interaction needs to be captured, communicated, and whatnot. Project plans need to be adapted, and what we're finding in our industry is they're not. This is not communicated very well. So a delay in a clearance. When we speak to executives, they believe this firmly, that it's 90 days to their 510K, 180 days for a PMA, and then that's when they start asking, hey, where are we in the process? They don't understand the breakdown. They don't understand the communication. They don't understand how many opportunities there are to get your submission rejected. Let's click to the next slide here. So this is from the FDA's refuse to accept policy. So critical to distinguish between the completeness of the submission and the quality of the data provided. This assessment of completeness of the 510K occurs during the acceptance review. This is where a lot of rejections happen. And then you get into the substantive. So I just wanted to share this. We don't need to do a deep dive on that. But again, I want to highlight this is just one health authority across the globe. And this is a health authority that is constantly changing with the rest of the globe. So this pain is compounded everywhere you go. So much time is going to be needed to educate the organization on your regulatory needs. I often have these types of presentations with quality managers, and I don't know the mix of the audience today. But I want to highlight by the end of this presentation that this is a quality engagement. In fact, in this policy, this refuse to accept policy, the term quality appears 16 times in this document. So just kind of planting us seeds for where we're going to go. Again, this is just an example of the FDA, but the pain is global and the pain is real. So just a quick question. If you were all here in the same room, we'd have a show of hands and get a little interactive, but we'll just go through this. So what percentage of submissions are kicked back at first review? I gave a version of this presentation a week ago, and the high was 30%. So that was the answer we got. So this is first review. This is clerical and formatting. That number is actually 70 to 90% for 510K and PMA. So this is from the MDUFA. I know everybody likes to pronounce and sound out acronyms in our industry, so I apologize if you hear that differently. But this was the quarterly report from September 2018. The point to address here is the FDA your development partner or your quality proofreader? It's interesting, having gone through this exercise in kind of designing a RIM solution and interacting with the industry. I have a counterpart in pharma. Pharma has their own batch of complexity. Obviously, they've got very large timelines. There's complex clinicals, but they have a very refined process for submitting. The FDA just understands it through and through. We're creating new novel devices. I mean, my smartphone could be a med device today. Combo products, all these different things and changes in the organization. You really need to go to the FDA as the expert in your product and your processes. They're learning as you're educating in med device. This statistic should not be acceptable in our industry. This is pretty crazy, especially when we get into the cost of these problems in the organization. So this is from the Emergo Group. This is a report I ran off of their site. So this is basically, we talked about that 90 days to your average FDA clearance, class 2. That's just not the case. This shows you the reality. The question to ask is, does this match executive expectation? In my experience, no, this did not. This was very difficult to communicate to our executives, especially where we are forecasting and relying on product being released in this next market for this next year. Expectations are always very high. Regulatory didn't often have a good answer for these slippages because of basic project management. I don't want to say deficiencies, but it's probably overburdened. We actually got into some statistics on regulatory staffing, and as an industry, we are understaffed. I promise you that. Who is reporting the cost of these slippages? How is this accounted for? How are things prioritized? So when we get into top strategies for simplifying your global submissions, it's really taking a holistic global approach. It's not just looking at the organization, it's looking at your organization as it exists across the globe through partners, affiliates, other branches and business units. But really, again, we'll do deeper dives, but you need to get procedures out now. There is a breakdown, like I mentioned, between my 8 submission managers. I had 8 processes. None of those were documented. None of those were unified. They were all kind of doing their best with what they had. Really more reactive than proactive. We're not doing very well in the industry here. So I've got this kind of policy, process, and procedures. This is basically from the top level strategy. What is outlined in your organization? How is regulatory information managed, communicated, and the procedures and processes to support that. Another thing is harmonization. How do these practices communicate to your partners in the field? What are the communication plans? How do you get this content to the right people at the right time and manage change control without that, or through all that? Ultimately, who owns the output and where does the output reside? We're going to get into some of the key pains and features needed in the industry. It was very eye-opening to me that one of the top ones was archiving. Just access to archived documents, dossiers, submission reports, clearances. That struck me as very interesting in 2018, that archiving and access and security controls is still a concern, but the pain is real. Again, this isn't, pull me back in if this gets sales pitchy, but this is just an interesting stat from MasterControl. We have competitors in the market, and we have opportunity to take market share from our competitors and whatnot. But our biggest opportunity by far is the fact that the industry's on paper, that there's paper processes still. So again, that's another glaring statistic in 2018. We have had instances in these discovery meetings where affiliates own the output. Your partners, your distributors, they're basically taking your content, reconfiguring it to the specific needs of that market, and then, for lack of a better term, holding that content hostage to a degree. And that is a very ugly term, but that is a reality out there. is that there's not a single source for this archive content. Resource and prioritize across the organization, across my organization, both in the industry and currently in my software development role. This is a very real struggle. Competing #1 initiatives. What does this regulatory engagement cost? I think we do a very good job of communicating the opportunity to get product X into Japan in 2019. I think that's very well communicated, the ROI, but the cost is not. Slippage is not captured. Project management delays, those are not captured in our industry. This is from a deep dive review of RIM suppliers in the market. This was just basically looking at the top, kind of the buzzwords on all their sites and marketing material. What is really needed for regulatory success? I'm not going to get into these one by one. We'll kind of bucket these things, but really, the needs of regulatory is to ensure compliance, to know that they've got the latest and greatest content. However you've configured that in your organization, they need to be at the table. They need to know, they need to be part of that. And really that's part of the quality conversation. That is part of the QMS engagement. Decreased time to market. We've got some stats coming up showing the cost of not getting to market as planned. Any increased time to market is good for the entire organization. Facilitate work efficiency, bring clarity, communication plans throughout the organization on what regulatory is up to. Data quality improvement, what are you reporting against? Access to this type of information. Really, a lot of this is also planned submission dates, planned due dates, planned product shipping dates, things of that nature. Visibility, again, to the organization. And then again, harmonizing your best practices. How do you take, now we've created procedures, we've created policies from the top level down. How do we communicate that across the globe and make sure that the content is coming back to us? And this is really what is being provided, is having a single access point to your content. Being able to go in, again, the right document at the right time. That is regulatory information management. But to me, this is quality management. Honestly, there's quality as a department, and then there's quality as just a process that's embedded across your organization. And I want to highlight how this is linked in this presentation. So again, kind of what is regulatory information management? It's document management. Whether you're paper, whether you're using my competitor, there are keys to how we can make this a much better configuration, accessible, whatnot. Dossier management, we'll get into that a little bit deeper in this presentation as well, but really treating a body of documents as one single record. How does that flow through your organization? Project management, archiving, like I mentioned, interactions is a big one. A thing to highlight is a lot of regulatory information management is managed across multiple enterprise solutions, your ERP, your CRM, your QMS, just disparate pieces of content and reporting and things that we need in real time, but they're in disparate solutions. Label change management, design downstream access, we'll get into that a lot more. One of the big features was publishing. I wanted to make a note on that. When you're looking at regulatory information management, a lot of this is a heavy consulting engagement with a software light presence to kind of support that. So the good solutions out there. I think it's a little bit different for medical device than pharma, where I think we control our publishing more in-house. We have our submission managers that are again kind of reactively communicating with the health authority to build these final reports in order to get product clearance. And again, a point I want to reemphasize here is you have a quality management system. You have something engaged already. We want to optimize these tools for you. So establishing that single source of truth, the metadata. I apologize, this is a screenshot, but this is going to be any digital QMS system, is going to be how to manage that metadata. So this is the metadata around the document. We call this the info card here. I've used Agile in my history, and I've come from a paper system as well. But really, how do we manage the content behind the document? Change control, expiration, things of that nature. Very interesting in 2 discovery meetings just in the last month, one for a customer and one just to go out and kind of help educate ourselves. A tier 1 customer presented us with 5 different info card types, basically 5 different metadata containers needed for their specific documents on top of their QMS, and then a handful of custom fields and attachments and a few things that they needed to capture in order to maximize their regulatory success and report the regulatory, all their regulatory concerns, versus another company, which I would categorize as a mid-level med device company. They presented us with over 300 document type info card types. I would argue that less is more in your digital solution. When you integrate your RIMs into your QMS, use it as an opportunity to approach this from a less is more standpoint. Really, you want to drive efficiency, right? You don't want to make over complexity. So whether it's MasterControl or somebody else, if you have that configuration engagement or re-engagement, take the opportunity to really dig into the metadata. Again, what this kind of provides you with is that traceability, where these documents came from, what they're linked to, how they're managed in change control, things of that nature. So really what we're talking about in terms of regulatory success is the dossier. So dossier means access control. This is security access control. It's kind of a focused view of a lot of documents that will live across multiple dossiers. But how do you configure that? How do you pull in affiliates? Let them have access to what they need to see and not hide, but they don't need to see what they don't need to see, right? So there's security access rights roles. I don't know how we manage this in a paper environment. Again, in my experience, we implemented Agile. I felt we were very successful at dossier management within Agile. Even having those tools, an interesting point to note when we talk about individual managers managing regulatory in very individualized ways, one of our submission managers was using bill of materials tool to create dossiers. So this is very much a need in the organization. We'll kind of get into how regulatory can impact the rest of the organization downstream. Again, this gives you export control, the ability to take snapshots, and again, not specific to MasterControl. This is what you should be looking at in any digital QMS or RIM system. So again, how does the rest of your enterprise solutions communicate? A little bit of acronym soup here. We could add PLM. We could add so much more to this. MES. There's so many systems that are basically creating content, either automated or capturing a complaint in your CRM and trying to get that into your QEM and leveraging the QMS, and documents are going to be revised. But really, it's understanding what that landscape looks like. There is no solution that fully integrates this. There's no push, play, and go. This is a large engagement, but it really is more than ever a regulatory concern. Where does the content live? Who is creating it? How is it organized? Is quite painful in this industry. And again, thoughtful configuration. How are you going to communicate with these disparate software? It's not just disparate departments or even business units across the globe. Kind of another tip here is creating project registration transparency. This is project management transparency. So I don't care if this is in Microsoft project, if this is in your QMS, or you have some other solution. We implemented a enterprise project management office when I was in the industry, and we pulled in regulatory to do an evaluation of the burden. Again, we are understaffed in the industry. Regulatory staffing is at about 1% in the organization, and we can show you the timelines. We can show you the slippages. We have shown you in this presentation that 80 to 90% are being rejected based on formatting and clerical. It shows us that we're overburdened. So these enterprise projects, these are enterprise level projects, whether you're submitting existing product into a new market or it's new product development, new product introduction, your regulatory managers are going to be overburdened at over 3 to 5 projects. So at this point, you can predict slippage. You can predict that there are going to be errors, and then you get into the cost of these errors. So how is your organization managing this currently? I think my key takeaway from this entire presentation, this version of this presentation been given for about a year, is you need to formalize project management in your organization. There's no other way to communicate this. It needs to be viewed as more than a regulatory activity. So we talked about how many enterprise level projects one person can successfully manage. Sure, that is variable from company to company and product to product, but I would say as a pretty safe rule, 5 is hitting the max there. Again, who owns the dossier? Who owns the dossier at which level? I'm going to get into a screen here that's showing how the dossier, right now we're talking about your submission, but we're going to be talking about your design history file, your lab book. Who owns the dossier at which phase? Who has access and when? Who reports success, bottlenecks, and failures? So this graph here is from LNS. This is just basically showing you your market share after 10 years after launch. This is the cost of slippage. Are you first to market, second to market, third to market? There are health authorities that if you're not cleared 6 months in advance, you're not going to be there next year. So we're already behind the 8 ball in many regards in the industry, but this is the cost of errors. So this is from Forbes, but basically when it comes to prioritization, I know that we have competing number ones in my current organization. We had competing number ones in my previous organization, but we need to measure the impact of a project against time, resources needed, and really understand the team's bandwidth. My takeaway from these 30 customers, prospects, med device companies in the industry is that bandwidth is not understood. It's basically we need it all and we need it all now. Again, we can point back to where this creates errors. The next point I would like to make is nailing down the moving targets. Who is your regulatory team? Regulatory can no longer have kind of a myopic view of their goals, right? Of we need to get this product cleared, we need to keep this product maintained, addendums, letters to file, whatever that may be. Your regulatory team, what I want to present is it's much broader than those with regulatory in their title. There's a unique executive role here. Regulatory is burdened with reporting slippages at the executive level. This impacts marketing, this impacts sales, this impacts manufacturing. It's a very unique role. I can't think of a role so unique in med device where you are in the hot seat to present these issues, these slippages, and ultimately probably not the fault of the regulatory manager. I would point back to processes and engagement. We're overburdened. We've got stats on the industry to support that. And then also the content, 90% of the regulatory dossier, the content is not created by regulatory. This is that whole downstream dossier access I spoke about a little bit earlier. So it's a very unique role, communicating at that level, communicating cross-functionally, but then also not being the author of 90% of the content needed for regulatory success. So again, visibility is just crucial. This is, again, from LNS, but this was a survey that went out last year. What were the issues on getting a product to market? The point I want to make here is not just, we've said you need a larger regulatory team. You need to pull in design, development, engineering, quality, all these different manufacturing, all these different departments, but really then you need to flip that coin and say, what teams does regulatory need to participate on, and how early can they get in on the content creation, the dossier. So this is a survey again from LNS. Issues in getting a product to the market. We've engaged too late. Regulatory's engaged too late. We don't know where our content is, these disparate systems, broken down processes. So I won't get through the entire list here, but how does regulatory impact these for success? What does that downstream engagement look like? So to kind of tell a story, this is the life of a document. This is for new product development and how we get that document to release. Conceptually, I always kind of tell this from a drawing. So at some point, a concept is created. This could be a drawing on a napkin over lunch, but an executive, some sort of champion marketing, has come to engineering with a new product that either a Me Too product or a completely novel thing to take to the health authority. a drawing is created. At this point, this drawing exists on the lab book. So this is that key dossier, right? They start to build and refine and test, and R&D has kind of the research branch has kind of a sandbox to play in. The FDA will kick down your doors if necessary, but this is a place where kind of proprietary information is managed. So who has access to the content? Who is contributing to the content? What is being created in order to basically supply development? So now we're getting into the design history file. That document, that drawing, those tests, etc. 80% of the lab book is now going to be populated into this dossier. We now have shared content. My design history files were printed, and I had drawings that were managed by a digital QMS. So again, we've gone rogue. We had breakdowns in our processes, being a hybrid digitized and paper-based system. Little bit of limited visibility. The FDA will want to look at your design history file, your tech file, whatnot. We get to a point where regulatory needs to be actively engaged with the health authority. And the point I want to make here is regulatory talking about testing needed to get equivalence, the clearance, whatever, to run your clinical, whatever that needs to be? Are they being engaged at this point, or are they steering the ship down here? This is a point I want to make on downstream access. Your regulatory team, as it is concerned with new product development, new product introduction, needs to start sooner. The most important thing you can do when configuring your QMS for RIM success is really planning on how do we inject the right people as soon as possible. My regulatory did not have access to research documentation. They had both physical barriers, their key cards would not get them in there, and they had configuration barriers. They did not have access to the documents. Me in development, I became the person in the middle. I learned very quickly. I would have a laundry list of to-do items from my submission manager basically every morning, and most of that was her trying to get access to steer the ship sooner. The term throwing documentation over the wall has kind of been an industry standard. It will not work in the changing regulatory environment. We need to look at these teams more holistically. So you get your product released, you're doing product surveillance, you have complaints, CAPAs are issued. This drawing goes back into review. We change this angle, it's safer, it's more effective, it can be manufactured to a higher level of degree. The document changes. How are we going to alert the rest of the organization? This document exists across 10 or so different dossiers with different needs across the organization. How is that communicated? Like I mentioned before, we had a breakdown. We had paper design history files. We didn't have a system to alert when this drawing was changed. This was very much a manual review every year. Training documents were paper. So again, getting these disparate processes that historically was the burden of quality in the QMS will no longer fly. One of the conversation topics we have a lot is quality as a department versus quality as kind of an embedded standard across your organization. So yes, quality does have a very distinct role, but the role of the QMS is really to facilitate everybody in downstream product development. So earlier this year, I went to an executive regulatory strategy training. It was a 4-day training. It was very in-depth, intense training, lots of notes and activities and all of that fun stuff. Didn't see the sun for a few days. Pretty much over my head, not being a complete regulatory expert, a seasoned regulatory expert like the people on this presentation. But at the end of that, we got one key takeaway from the professor teaching this course. And it was really, how are you going to manage regulatory success from an executive strategy? It is the ability of your organization to inject regulatory best practices earlier and through all the departments across the product lifecycle. If you think back to my last slide, we cannot be siloed anymore. What are the tools you have to digitally make this happen? What are the processes you have to physically make this happen, right? Can we give regulatory access to the research lab? So that was very eye-opening. I just saved you 4 days, a lot of time and money. This is the one takeaway you needed from that course. Finally, what we have here is knowing what's changing and adapt. I was a moderator on a panel last week, just talking about MDR, just MDR on this list, and this list could be a lot broader. I hope there's some quality people on this call today, because I want to scare you. This is the perfect storm that I mentioned at the start of this presentation. You cannot guarantee that existing released product is not going to experience a hiccup in Europe in the next few years. Money that you have come to rely on and depend on, and you've reported to your VP of sales and marketing and your CEO, there's some waves on the horizon here. We're not staffed appropriately. One of the key conversation topics in this presentation, or in this panel last week, was that regulatory is staffed at 1%. That same LNS report that I grabbed a few of these slides from was talking about basically an organization needs to be staffed at 25% for just new product development alone. Regulatory is a key player, a key stakeholder in product development. And I want to make sure that that's kind of understood. This is unprecedented. The amount of change in the industry, this should be terrifying to everybody. It's not just your organization who is behind and understaffed. The health authorities, they're understaffed. Your notified bodies, if you haven't engaged on MDR, you're in a lot of trouble. So this is the time. I mentioned earlier, we might be a year or two too late, but you're never too late to minimize the damage, right? So now is the time to address this. Now is the time to formalize these processes in these teams. So really, in conclusion here, to look at regulatory success on a global scale, you need to adopt a global submissions approach. You need your internal plans and your external plans. This is project management. This is document control, change control, who is alerted when, how do we manage expiration dates, renewal dates, things of that nature. And then equip your regulatory and submissions team with the appropriate tools. You have an existing QMS. Take the time to sit down with regulatory, bring regulatory at the table and say, hey, how do we leverage this to be your RIM? Do we want to go buy another separate, disparate RIM system? That's probably a step forward. I would argue that you have the tools to do that today. So take the time to pull them to the table and get them more engaged in the quality management system. Understand what documents are being printed. Where are rogue documents across regulatory? Again, project management, I can't beat that point to death enough. And then really, it's that participation in new product development. Pull regulatory in immediately. These are your partners in success. Get them in at the research level. Help them guide the testing. Help them guide design before the design history file. And then my final key takeaway is educate. We have learned that executives aren't educated to the needs and burdens that the regulatory department face every day. Again, being reactive versus proactive. How do you report against plan failures when there is no plan? So that is, to me, the big one, is really get your organization involved, make sure they understand, educate, report. And again, I think that goes back to project management. That concludes my slide. I'm going to pull this up if there's any questions. I don't know where we are in terms of time here. I did have a few questions come over, and I'll try and frame those really quick. One was, and I may have addressed this as part of the presentation, but I'll go back to that, is we already have our QMS configured. We're up and we're running. Best practices for that. I think, again, that is pull them back to the table. I'll go back to the example I sent of the two companies. One was the large company, and they needed about less than 20 configuration changes in order to say that they could successfully manage RIMs. The other one was nowhere near that size, and they needed hundreds. So they were looking at a full new configuration. And again, I would argue that's not what's needed. What's needed is a thoughtful environment for regulatory to make sure they have access. The next one was communication strategy for change control in a paper process. That's just tough, right? I think we've all been there. We've all been in the paper process with that. Whether you've purchased some sort of digitized system whether you've been able to configure very creatively in like Office 365, however you're managing that. Really, in my mind, the cost is whether you have a digital QMS, a digital RIMS versus a paper or disparate process, you're experiencing those costs anyway in terms of full-time employees, document administration in order to get those kind of details across the board. So I hope that added a little bit of clarity there. I don't see any other questions. So I do know that AdvaMed will collect questions for a time. They'll send out this presentation with my contact information. I'm interested in talking to everybody. Again, I'm not sales. This isn't a sales pitch to me. I'm very interested in your processes as they exist today. Success and failures, that's very valuable to me. So I look forward to continuing this conversation, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you to everyone that joined us today for this great webinar. As Alex mentioned, you will be receiving the presentation along with a recording of the webinar within the next 24 hours. If you have any questions that you want to follow up, I will provide Alex's contact information along with my own. So please feel free to send us any questions that you have. And on behalf of AdvaMed, I just want to thank Alex and MasterControl one more time for providing this great presentation. And I want to thank you all for joining. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.